Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is TowerGate day 353. And in this particular TowerGate, which may cover possibly 2 days, I'm going to try to do it in 1 day. I'm going to lay out the case for the frame-up of Donald Trump. It's going to take me at least 2 30-minute videos to do this, possibly even 3. So I will get the first 2 up on Sunday. And if there is a third video, then it will come up on Monday. But I'm going to try to get it done in 2 videos, which you can get both of them on Sunday. It'll be part 1 and part 2. It'll be day 353, part 1 and 2. And then if we have to have a third video, that would occur on day 354 as a separate video, as part 3. So with so much to cover, let's go ahead and get started on this. And this is something I've been working on for a couple of weeks now, digging into a lot of information. And so let's first start off by telling you what I'm talking about here. This entire operation, the entire counterintelligence operation, to me was one big frame-up. And the original intention was to have a frame-up operation, a political operation, which would prevent Trump from being elected. But when that failed, then it turned into another type of operation to destroy the presidency of Donald Trump. Because what happened there was this was supposed to be the October surprise. But the problem, well, there was really 2 problems mainly, a lot of problems, but 2 primarily. The first problem was that the dossier, which was supposed to be the big bombshell, the October surprise, didn't happen. It didn't happen for 2 reasons. Number one, because once they got the information from the dossier and they were out there trying to peddle it, they couldn't find any news organizations who would publish it. They were able to get Yahoo News and a couple other places to make some mentions of it, and the campaign was out there dropping these little hints about Trump Russia. There were other little stories that popped up and other little attempts at setups as part of the frame-up, but it never was able to go live in time. It was supposed to come out probably about 2 weeks before the vote in November, but they just simply couldn't, no one could corroborate it, and no one wanted to be the one unleashing a story like this that they couldn't verify because of the liability for civil litigation, being sued by Trump and others mentioned in the dossier. It was finally published, however, by BuzzFeed on January the 10th of 2017, but only after the meeting with Comey and Trump 3 days before, which caused it to be, in BuzzFeed's opinion, newsworthy. Of course, Mr. Gubarev, the man who was named as being the guy who owned the company, who his company allegedly, Webzilla, did the physical hacking, he of course has a problem with it, and he sued BuzzFeed and Christopher Steele. And now Carter Page has also filed a lawsuit, a libel suit against Christopher Steele and BuzzFeed. And 3 Russian bankers, also mentioned in the dossier, have filed libel suits against BuzzFeed and Christopher Steele. As well as the most recent, Michael Cohen, Trump's attorney, has also now filed a lawsuit against BuzzFeed and Christopher Steele, or Fusion GPS. It's BuzzFeed and Fusion GPS that Mr. Cohen is suing. So this is what all these media outlets were afraid of. They were afraid of exactly what's happening to BuzzFeed and Fusion GPS right now. So they wouldn't publish the dossier. So the big bomb that was supposed to be dropped was never dropped. And another thing that complicated that was just before, about a week or so before the election, Comey was forced to reopen the Hillary Clinton email investigation. He tried not to, but he had no choice because other people had the story, and he couldn't hold it back. So what he had to do was come out and announce he was reopening the investigation. Then he told us after 2 days that they went through, 500,000 emails and didn't find anything, and therefore she was clear. So he cleared her for the second time just prior to the date of the election. So this is basically what the dossier and all this frame-up was intended it was intended to be. It was intended to be the October surprise that would destroy Trump and allow the rotten Reverend Clinton, crooked Hillary, to win the election. It didn't work out that way. So let's talk about frame-ups. What is a frame-up? Essentially, a frame-up is defined as a conspiracy to falsely incriminate someone. Now, in this case, what we have, and like many frame-ups, we have a frame-up that, in this particular case, was a counterintelligence operation wrapped in a political operation inside a presidential coup d'etat. Let me try that one more time. We have a frame-up that, in this case, was a counterintelligence operation wrapped in a political operation inside a presidential coup d'etat. Now, when you have a frame-up, what you need to sell the frame-up is setups, many setups that all put together lead to the overall frame-up. Now, let me give you an example how easy it is to frame someone. In the FBI, the CIA, intelligence agencies, individuals, a lot of people use frame-ups. And again, to get a frame-up, to sell the frame-up, you need to have a lot of small setups which feed the larger frame-up. So let me give an example of how that might work. Let's just say that I want to frame one of you. Let's just say what I'm going to do then is I'm going to follow you, and maybe I find out that you like to go to Starbucks or Tim Hortons or some little coffee shop every morning and get some coffee. And in the process, you have a conversation with the same guy at the counter who serves you your coffee every morning. What I might do is just simply observe that, and then after you leave the coffee shop at some point, I might walk in there and have a little conversation with the guy who serves you your coffee every morning. I might feel him out and see if maybe there's anything about him that's a little suspicious, anything I might learn about him. And then I might do a little bit of study on him, find out who he talks to, what he might be involved in, if there's anything dirty about him. If there is, then I can now draw a clear connection between you and him. But maybe I can't find anything on him. Maybe I hang around the coffee shop a little while and wait for some other people to walk in. Maybe I see a couple people walk in who appear to be suspicious or appear to have some character or some quality about their character or lack of quality about their character that makes me suspicious. So maybe I could do a little research on them. Maybe they're into some drug dealing. Maybe they're into some other illegal activity. Maybe they're into some other unsavory activities. And then I could then tie them to the guy at the coffee shop, and I could then tie you to the guy at the coffee shop. Therefore, saying, hey, well, you have these little conversations with this guy at the coffee shop, and I've overheard a couple conversations, and some other people have overheard conversations where you're talking about this subject, and then I've got this other guy who comes in, and he has conversations about this subject. That puts you in this situation. So there's a bit of what I would call a passive type frame-up, and you have passive and active type frame-ups. So let's look at another real-world example of a frame-up, and then another type of frame-up, which is also called sheep dipping. Now, the difference between a basic frame-up and a sheep dip, and the CIA is typically the ones that use the sheep dipping. The FBI generally works with the standard frame-up. So essentially, when you do a frame-up, you have a lot of things going on around your target, but your target, is never really used himself. He's just having a lot of things happen around him, but he's not really a part of it or targeted in it. He's just the guy you're going after. In the sheep dipping operation, you actually involve your target in his own frame-up. Okay, so that would be called sheep dipping. So let's talk about a real-world example that we have a lot of evidence of a frame-up sheep dipping as well. The case of Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald, as we all know, was in the Marine Corps, and he was recruited by Naval Intelligence to be a part of the fake defector program into the Soviet Union. Once he returned from the Soviet Union, having been in this naval intelligence operation, he was recruited by the CIA. His handler was David Atlee Phillips. David Atlee Phillips worked directly under George Herbert Walker Bush, who was head of Caribbean operations. And of course, the things that Lee Harvey Oswald and the people he were running around with and the things they were doing were all tied to the Cuba operations. George Herbert Walker Bush was running the Cuba operations, and David Atlee Phillips was working under him. And so this is how Oswald got caught up in that. Now, what happened was Robert Kennedy had learned, who was Attorney General at the time, that the CIA was running these secret training camps down near Lake Pontchartrain, Louisiana, and he wanted them shut down. So he called up Hoover and said, hey, I've just learned about these secret camps that the CIA's got going on. They're trying to put together another overthrow of Cuba or another invasion of Cuba. They're training all these Cuban mercenaries. It's done illegally. I hear that they're moving lots of weapons and stuff in there. I want you to shut it down. So they begin investigating, and they stumbled upon someone they were familiar with, Lee Harvey Oswald, who had been, of course, recruited by the CIA and was doing very low-level work. And he was working out of the offices of a guy named Guy Bannister, who was a former FBI field office head before he left the FBI and went to work kind of for the CIA and kind of as an independent as well. And so basically what they did, they decided, well, Oswald is hanging out with a lot of these guys who are involved in these training camps. He's hanging out with David Ferry. We know that Guy Bannister is the guy that's moving the weapons to this to these training camps down there on Lake Pontchartrain. So maybe we can get Oswald. So he was then recruited and paid a monthly salary by the FBI. His handler at the FBI was the guy he reported to was FBI agent Hosty. We know that because Hosty's business card and number were found on Oswald when he was arrested. And Hosty also testified in front of a committee where he admitted that he was handling Lee Harvey Oswald and that they were getting various information about these training camps going on in Lake Pontchartrain. So Oswald's job was to just go to these training camps with David Ferry and some of these other characters, observe what was going on there, and report back to the FBI, to his handler, Mr. Hosty, as to the number of people that were involved, the names of the people that were involved, what type of things were going on there, what type of activities. And this was all reported back to Hosty, and eventually the FBI went in and shut down these camps. Now, the CIA probably figured out that Oswald was the guy that gave up the information, and that's probably why, one of the reasons why, he was targeted to be a patsy in the JFK assassination. So what they did when they started to decide they would use Oswald as a patsy, they decided to frame him. And this required a bunch of mini setups to frame him. For instance, the CIA got what they have many of these types of people who do like impersonations. They get someone who can look like Oswald, talk like Oswald, and do things like that. And they would have this Oswald double that they used. Like one instance, he goes to a shooting range, and he goes to the shooting range and he starts firing on some other guy's target. Keeps doing it. The guy comes over and says, "Hey, dude, you're shooting at my target." And Oswald, of course, gets into a heated confrontation with him and says, "Yeah, I'm shooting at your target because I feel like it. What are you going to do about it?" You know, and this type of thing. So this guy then, he goes and gets the owner or the guy running the gun range and says, "Hey, this guy here is shooting at my target and he's giving me a lot of grief," or whatever. So Oswald, eventually, he's kicked off the range, but not before he tells them, "Hey, you remember me? I'm Lee Oswald. Don't forget that name, Lee Oswald." So that was one instance of a part of a frame-up, and this was one setup operation of many that would be part of the overall frame-up. Then another time, his double goes onto a car lot in Dallas, and he walks in the car lot, and then he gets into a confrontation with the salesman. He's asking him, "Don't you have any Russian cars on this lot?" And the guy's like, "What do you mean Russian cars? Who wants a Russian car?" And Oswald's like, "Yeah, they make the best cars. These cars are junk." In which case the salesman gets, basically upset with this Oswald impersonator. He says, "Well, I'll tell you what, buddy, you get your ass off my lot before I kick your ass," And before he walks off the lot, of course, he says, "Well, yeah, but you remember me, Lee Oswald. Lee Oswald. Don't forget that name, pal." So he walks off the lot. Then, of course, we have the story about Oswald on two different occasions visiting the embassy down in Mexico, the Cuban embassy, I believe it was. And there was two occasions. One of them actually may have been Oswald down at the Cuban embassy in Mexico, but one of them we believe was his double, because they have just a bit of video cam where you can see the guy and he looks nothing like Oswald, but he was pretending to be Oswald. We also have another case where he allegedly shot through the window of some local official, and he didn't kill him, but somebody fired a gunshot through the window, and it was blamed on Oswald. Then we have the photo that everyone has seen, the faked photo that was later proven to be fake. It looked pretty bad to begin with, but years later, once the technology was there, they proved that the photo was obviously doctored. And the photo, of course, was the one where Oswald's holding the 2 rifles. And that was another part of the frame-up. They obviously superimposed Oswald's head onto another body, and that is just another one of the many setups that were all part of a larger frame-up of Lee Harvey Oswald. And there were several more that were done. Of course, then they didn't just use these setups as part of a frame-up on Oswald. Then they went to the sheep dipping, which has actually used Oswald. And in this particular case, they told Oswald, they said, we want you to go out here and pass out these flyers that are flyers that say fair play for Cuba. And we want you to go out and pretend that you are supporting Cuba. And the point is we want you to hand out these flyers, and anyone that takes these flyers, we're going to have our other guys follow them and find out who they are and what they're involved in. So you're going to do like the honey trap, you know, you're going to hold out these flyers and see who's interested in taking a flyer supporting Cuba. So out there is Oswald doing what he's told, passing out these flyers, fair play for Cuba. Then a fight is staged. Now, Oswald doesn't know that this is going to be done to him, but they stage a fight. They have a couple guys actually start a fight with Oswald, knowing good and well it'll bring some TV reporters or police or whatever. So sure enough, an altercation ensues. The media shows up. They get a couple photographs of Oswald. The police report is made, and now Oswald is, they got Oswald on video and a news report that he's out there supporting Fidel Castro in Cuba with his Fair Play for Cuba campaign. And it never had anything to do with tracking down anybody who would take the flyers or anything like that. It was purely a setup of Oswald. Then they got Oswald to go on a local radio station and try to make the argument supporting Marxism. And he was trying to define the difference between Marxism and communism and socialism and these various types of things. Now, Oswald thought he was working for the CIA, doing some sort of counterintelligence, again, to try to draw supporters of Fidel Castro to him so that they could be identified and cataloged and followed and investigated and whatever. But really had nothing to do with that at all. They just wanted Oswald on radio, on record of Oswald going on the radio or TV and making the argument for Marxism, you see. So Oswald was now being used himself to set himself up. That's called sheep dipping. So we have frame-ups and we have sheep dipping. Very, very effective. And this is what happened, and I imagine it still continues to happen, but particularly it was happening over the summer of 2016 and may have actually began as early as late October of 2015 with these individual instances of setups that would later become the larger frame-up. And there's a few main ones I want to focus on. There's quite a few, about 9 or 10 that I listed, but because of time, I'm just going to focus on the main ones, particularly one primary, 2 secondary, and then 2 other that were minors that never really went anywhere. So the first one that I want to just mention for a moment was this original, the first one, you guys probably may remember this, the very first one of these little setups occurred early in the summer when it was alleged that Trump had a server in Trump Tower that was pinging or being pinged by another server that was somehow getting Russian transmissions and Russian communications. Now, this, of course, was debunked pretty quickly. It was investigated and debunked pretty quickly. But again, keep in mind, a lot of times with these setups or these types of things, it doesn't matter if it's true. It doesn't matter if it's true, because we all know that a lie travels around the globe in about 10 seconds, but it may take a day, a week, a month, or a year, or many years to actually debunk it. By then, the damage has been done. And that's what the case was with this Trump Tower computer pinging or whatever. It turned out that this computer was an old server, an old computer server that was used for marketing campaigns for the Trump his Trump business, of which he has over 100 different businesses, and many of them had marketing campaigns. So this thing would just send out marketing stuff to various places all around the world, and of course it would get receipts and responses from all that. So you'd have this constant pinging of this marketing server going on, and probably getting hits from and pings from everywhere in the world, probably, because Trump's an international businessman, and these 100 businesses or so probably had marketing campaigns going on universally around the globe, or to most places in the world, modern, places. So this was put out there. It was probably a leak that got it out there in the first place, and it made some news headlines. It was out there for about a week, and then a lot of people were talking about it, that this was somehow some secret server that Trump was using to backdoor communicate with Kremlin or whatever. But it turned out to be just a marketing computer that was largely obsolete, and they'd even forgotten about it. It was running old marketing campaigns from 10 years ago. But it just sat there and kept operating and kept sending out these pings and stuff and getting return pings and things like that. So it all got debunked, but it was one of the very first little setups that really flopped. It didn't really go anywhere. It didn't really get much attention. It did for a few days, but it largely went away after a few days and didn't get much play. So that was one of the early little setups, part of the larger frame-up that never went anywhere. Then, of course, we had the Papadopoulos meeting with Alexander Downer, the Australian diplomat over in England, and we're going to focus on that a little bit because that did get substantial play, not so much after it happened or initially, but it was 2.5 months later after this meeting occurred that allegedly Downer got the information about this conversation he had with Papadopoulos, and it found its way into the system at the FBI, the CIA, or whatever. And then, of course, it was used by the New York Times to try to rescue the operation once the dossier had been completely debunked, or at least ways most of us believe it's completely debunked. There's obviously still people, including Mueller, that are still using the dossier and trying to sell it. But once the dossier had gone through a bad week and had pretty much been debunked, the New York Times, someone leaked this to them, and then they ran that big story, if you remember, that, it was Papadopoulos talking to Alexander Downer that actually launched all this because the dossier had lost its credibility. They needed to save the operation, and so they dropped this Papadopoulos story on us. Of course, we knew it was all bullshit because there's not a single word in any of the FISA warrants or any of the intelligence information prior to that about this conversation between Papadopoulos and Alexander Downer that had anything to do with anything. It was just something that was brought in at the last moment. Of course, I debunked it. Many other people debunked it. Son of Nuo definitely debunked it within literally days after the Papadopoulos-Alexander Downer story came out. But again, it got enough play that it went around the world, and it was, chum out there for everyone to go after for a good 2 weeks or so before it was completely obliterated and gone. But it did the necessary thing it was designed to do, was it kept everything pretty much going. And that's the idea here, to keep everything going. So you continue to have all these little setups as part of the larger frame-up. Some of them fall on their face. Some of them have legs. Some of them are debunked quickly. Some take a while to debunk. But it's most important is that you just keep piling more and more and more of this stuff out there so that it all adds up at some point. And at some point, the only thing people remember is that these stories were out there and they had some impact, but they never really think about the fact that they were debunked, or maybe they have not been debunked yet. And they're still out there, and they all have a cumulative effect, so that when it comes time to drop the final nail in the coffin and take out your target, you have all this stuff. And you can say, well, that stuff, some has been debunked, some of it's not been debunked. We're still talking about it. It actually meant something, and you can muddy up the waters, and all this stuff still stays out there, and it kind of hangs on, and you never really get rid of it. And it all kind of fits into this narrative, or tries to fit into the narrative, which feeds the larger frame-up operation. We, of course, had the Carter Page and Paul Manafort. Now, again, this is a classic case of you want to frame your target, and so you look at people close to your target and see who they might have association with. Goes back to the first example I gave you, where I could walk into a coffee shop and see that you have a conversation with this individual, and if I can tie this individual to something, I can tie you to him. If I can't tie him to anything illegal or criminal or questionable, I can wait for someone else that he may have a conversation with who can be tied to something criminal, and then I have you still involved because you're talking to a guy who's talking to a guy that has this criminal activity. And this is how Carter Page and Paul Manafort came into the picture, because Manafort, of course, worked on the Trump campaign for a while, and he's been working as a lobbyist, primarily specializing in working with Eastern Europeans, specifically Ukrainians and Russians, and his work as a lobbyist, as the Podestas do the exact same thing. They were, in fact, working alongside Manafort on all this, despite the fact that they haven't been indicted, only Manafort. Carter Page was an easy target because he was an unpaid volunteer to the Trump campaign. He's an energy expert, and of course he works literally in Russia a lot of the year. He's a number 2 man at Merrill Lynch for their European energy sector. He has lots of contacts. He gives speeches. He meets with lots of Russians. He focuses, and his profession is that he's an energy consultant, and he's primarily based in Eastern Europe and Russia, in that area there. And he is, of course, you could tie him to Trump. So in this particular frame-up, you get guys like Manafort and Carter Page. You can tie them to the Russians, and therefore, because they worked on his campaign, you can tie them to Trump. Then, of course, probably the most obvious and the biggest of the setups that made up the larger frame-up was the meeting at Trump Tower. And that's the one I'm going to focus the most on. We have the most players, and they lead the most places. Okay? So I'm going to start going through these various setups that were part of the overall larger frame-up. And so I'm going to be focusing on targets or on individuals here. We've been talking in the past several months, really looking at, because of the texts and things and such, we've been talking a lot about Page and Strzok. We've been talking a lot about Bruce and Nellie Orr. We've been talking a lot about McCabe. We've been talking a lot about Comey and Lynch and all these other people, Fusion GPS, Christopher Steele, Blumenthal, all these people who are kind of on the inside. They're on the inside players. And they're the type of people who launch the setups which are part of the frame-up. But today, I want to focus on the characters, the players, the plants, who are actually the actors, who are put into motion, who are the guys on the peripheral that sell these setups and frame-ups, who are actually used in the setup or frame-up. Whether they're actors and they know what they're doing and they're being paid, like the Oswald double, or whether they're individuals who don't even know they're being used, like maybe the guy at the coffee shop who gives you your coffee every morning. He doesn't even realize he's being used as part of a frame-up on you. And some of these people I don't know. Some of these people may know and were part of the operation, part of the frame-up, knew what they were doing. Some of these people may have just been individuals who happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. They served a particular interest, and so therefore they were used because of who they are, who they know, what they do, where they go, and this type of thing. And so we're going to go through these outside players who are kind of on the outside edge, but all feed in and are all part of these setups which lead to the ultimate frame-up. So let's start first with George Papadopoulos. He's the most mysterious figure that we have, and we still really haven't figured out exactly who he was planted for, working for, whether he was part of it, whether he knew he was part of it. It's really hard to tell. I haven't figured it out. A lot of people have theories. I just don't know. I mean, when you look at Papadopoulos, I mean, he's got ties to, of course, he worked in the Hillary Clinton State Department. You could say, okay, he's got ties to Clinton. Well, he also attended, was a regular at this spy school in Rome, Italy. He was a friend of Mr. Misfid, the professor, who's source B in the dossier. And of course, Papadopoulos had communications with 4 of the 5 alleged sources of the dossier. We know that Christopher Steele was in Rome, Italy, and that's where on 2 occasions he briefed FBI agents. So you could say, well, if Papadopoulos was at the spy school, Link University, in the summer of 2016, and Christopher Steele was there as well, briefing the FBI, then maybe he's one of Steele's guys. You could also tie him to Fusion GPS. You could also tie him probably directly to David Kramer and Senator Magoo, because Kramer also attends a lot of these conferences and a lot of these places where Papadopoulos liked to hang out and like to visit. A lot of the people he met with and people like that, also people who David Kramer could have come in contact with. So it's hard to say whether he was a plant and he knew it, whether he was being used and he didn't know it, whether he was whether he came from Confusion GPS, whether he came from inside the Clinton camp, whether he came from Christopher Steele, whether he was an FBI plant. It's just hard to say because he has connections to just about everybody and everything, but yet he remains this mysterious character. And of course, we know he gets charged for lying to the FBI, and then of course, but he's never been sentenced. He's never been sentenced. He agreed to work with the FBI, to wear a wire. Now all of a sudden, poof. But he was still supposed to face sentencing. He didn't get totally off. He wasn't supposed to. He was supposed to get a lesser sentence. But all of a sudden, Papadopoulos, after we hear, well, he's pled guilty to lying to the FBI and this and that and the other thing, well, all of a sudden we don't hear about him being sentenced. We don't hear anything about him. He's just now, poof, disappeared into the ether. Nothing more about Papadopoulos. And of course we know that prior to the New York Times article, no one was ever even talking about Papadopoulos. And so we really don't know exactly who he was connected to or what he was connected to or anything else. It's he's into the ether. I expect that when we get to the bottom of all this, I think that we probably will find out who Papadopoulos was a plant for, and I'm saying I believe he was a plant. He went to spy school down there at Link University. He's hanging out with the professor, Source B, Joseph Misfit, who's apparently the guy who was primarily the one selling the theory that the Russians had blackmail material on Trump. He was the one that was pushing that theory, although Mr. Milian has denied being a source for the dossier. He has denied telling the things that Papadopoulos said he told him, and in fact I think that's one of the lies that he was pled guilty to. Milian says that Papadopoulos was, a dreamer, that he was making up things, and that all these things that he said were not true. We know Papadopoulos met with him at least twice. We know once at Link University where Misfit was lecturing, and another time he met with a woman who we're going to be talking about, who he struck up an affair with, who at one time had worked for Milian, and they had a conversation together. So we're going to kind of look and start first by looking at George Papadopoulos and the associations he had and what his role was in one of these setups, which would later be used as part of the frame-up. Now, as we talked about, they had this setup operation with Papadopoulos. He's connected to all 4 of the 5 sources of the dossier. Then he has this conversation with Alexander Downer. But Alexander Downer, from what we're told, doesn't report this conversation for 2.5 months. Why is that? If this was all a setup, one of the setups that was part of the larger frame-up, then why did they wait so long to use this? They could have used it a long time ago. It occurred even before the November elections. This was something they had in the can that they could have dropped. It was one of the setups that they ran as part of the larger frame-up, but it was never used until the New York Times decided to drop the story after it was leaked to them that he was actually the reason they went and got the warrants to surveil Carter Page and Manafort, because the dossier had been essentially debunked. So I have some thoughts on this as to why the Papadopoulos Alexander Downer setup did not come into play originally as it was probably intended. I think it probably has to do with the fact that once they did this setup and they had this together, I think that they probably thought, well, if we go ahead and drop this now, we have our inside guy in there, Papadopoulos, our plant. If we drop this now, he's exposed. He's done. He can't do any more work for us. He can't get any more information for us. We're going to have to, people are going to be talking about him now. He will have to be investigated and all these other things. What we need is to keep him around a little longer. That could have been one reason. It also could have been possible that they looked at the situation. Some people said, "Yeah, that was a pretty cool setup you did with Downer and Papagalopoulos. It looks, it's good, but quite honestly, there's a lot of questions about this.